Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Sunday? Paul in the Great Northwest, Karen in Northern California, Bill in Missouri, Melissa in Great Neck, Shandora in the Bronx, Renee in Indiana. I'm so glad you're here. Guy in Ohio. Paul says, "Hear you, Sal." Yosef in Englewood, New Jersey, Lucy in Minnesota, Joe in the Inland Empire, Chaim in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia, Ella in Southern California. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by our very own Renee Fought in Indiana. And she's dedicating our show for the healing of Windridge. I'm sorry if I say this wrong, Renee, but Windridge, Indy, and Hakelev. Hakelev means the dog, which is Renee's MS Society service dog. And I know that the dog means so much to you, Renee, and we are davening that Windridge, Indy, Ann should have a refuah shlema, complete healing. We say amen. And Renee, thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. And the merit of that, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings, and we say amen. Our daf today is page 150 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. I think this is the longest tractate in the Talmud, and we certainly put a dent in it. 150 pages. We've been in it for about 5 months. And I think it's 185 is the total page count. Something like that, right? 176. So, okay, so 25 pages from the end, more or less. Okay, we're continuing our discussion with Mishna number 7 here in chapter 9. We're picking this up about a third of the way down, page 150a. It is obvious, says the Gemara, which means it may not be so obvious to us, but it is obvious that if one said, I give my movable property to so-and-so, then that person acquires all of his utensils, excluding his wheat and barley. So we're still talking about somebody who makes a deathbed gift where something that is given is going to be acquired by the recipient, even without the kinyan, even without the formal act of acquisition. And here we're really talking about what is this person who's on his deathbed trying to give away. So he says, I give my movable property to such and such person, right? So then that person acquires all of his utensils, right? All of the things that he owns, not obviously it's movable property, so not real property, meaning not land. But this excludes his wheat and barley. So if he has a silo full of food, that's not going to be included in movable property. But if one said, I give all my movable property, as opposed to my movable property versus all of my movable property. So if he says all of my movable property to so-and-so, then that person acquires even the wheat and barley. And he acquires even the upper millstone, since it is occasionally removed from its place. He acquires all the property that is not land or houses, except for the lower millstone, which is never moved, right? So we talked about this before, the upper and lower millstone. This is how he grinds his grain, whether wheat or barley, etc. The lower millstone is in place. The upper millstone can be taken off. That's how we get grain in there. It can also be pledged and used as collateral, right? But the Torah warns us not to do that, because then you're taking away the ability of somebody to grind their food and to make a livelihood. So we'd rather not take away someone's upper millstone, but it is movable, whereas the lower millstone is truly fixed in place. And if he said, I give everything that can be moved to so-and-so, then that person acquires even the lower millstone, since it is possible to move it, even though it is rarely, if ever, moved. A dilemma was raised before the sages. Is the legal status of a Canaanite slave like that of land, or is his status like that of movable property? Now, this question has come up a bunch of times when slavery was practiced, a tremendous evil, but it was practiced in the ancient world long before the Torah was given. When the Torah was given, slavery was not abolished. I think God realized that that was not, that we were not going to move that far forward at that time. But when the Torah was given, the practice of slavery, at least for the Jews, was utterly transformed, because slaves had rights. This was something unheard of in the ancient world. Nevertheless, they were property of the owner. And then the question is, are they treated like land, real property, or like movable property? You would think, well, a slave is not land, so a slave moves, it must be like movable property. But generally speaking, in halacha, in law, slaves are treated like land. But now, that's usually in the realm of inheritance. Now that we're talking about deathbed gifts, are we going to say that a slave is treated exactly like land? No, we are not. So let's see. So Rav Acha, the son of Rav Avia, said to Rav Ashi, come and hear a proof from a Mishnah. The Mishnah we had on page 68 of this tractate. A landowner who sells the city has sold with it the houses and the ditches and caves and the bathhouses and the olive presses and the irrigated fields, but not the movable property. Right? So when you sell real property, you're selling what is attached to it, what is fixed, what is constant in the real property, and that's to the exclusion of movable property, right? When you sell your house, typically you move your furniture and clothes and money and all your movable property out of the house before you give it to the new owner. But when the seller said to the buyer, I am selling it and everything that is in it, then even if there were animals or Canaanite slaves in the city, they are all sold. Rav Acha, the son of Rav Avi, explains the proof. So granted, if you say that the legal status of a Canaanite slave is like that of movable property. Due to that reason, he is not sold in the first case. But if you say that the legal status of a Canaanite slave is like that of land, well, why was he not sold along with the city and all the other real property that went with it? Why did it need to be specified that the seller has to say, I'm selling you it, the city, and everything that is in it, and only then would it include Canaanite slaves? Must be that they are not treated like real property, like land. Rav Ashi replied, rather, what do you say? Do you maintain that his legal status is like that of movable property? But if there is no difference in legal status between Canaanite slaves and movable property, then what is the reason that the Mishnah emphasizes in the second case that even the Canaanite slaves are sold? Rather, what have you to say to explain this? One must explain that movable property that moves by itself is different from movable property that does not move by itself. And therefore, one might have thought that although the sale includes movable property, Canaanite slaves are not included in the sale. In the same manner, even if you say that the legal status of a Canaanite slave is like that of land, so land that moves is different from land that does not move. Therefore, the legal status of Canaanite slaves cannot be proved from this Mishnah about selling a city, and if you say the words and it and everything that is in it would include the slaves. From that Mishnah, we have not learned out, are Canaanite slaves treated under the law like movable property or like real property? They seem to occupy some, space in between. Ravina said to Rav Ashi, come and hear a proof from a Mishnah in Tractate Peah 3.8. Tractate Peah, sometimes I mention Mishnahs that come from other tractates that are not Talmud tractates in the sense that they're not Gemara tractates, right? They're not volumes in the Talmud Bavli. They are tractates in the Mishnah, right? So the Gemara is a commentary on the Mishnah, but not every tractate of the Mishnah received a Gemara commentary so that it ended up being a tractate in the Talmud Bavli. This is also true of Pirkei Avos. Pirkei Avos is not a separate volume in the Talmud Bavli. It is a separate volume in the Mishnah. Okay. So Ravina said to Rav Ashi, come and hear a proof from Mishnah Peah 3.8. With regard to one who writes, i.e. gives via a document, all of his property to his Canaanite slave, the slave has been emancipated. Okay, so your Canaanite slave, when this was practiced, was your property. If, you become very fond of your Canaanite slave, you're aging out, you're going to die, and you say, you know what, I'm going to give all my property. I'm making my Canaanite slave, who has been with me all these years, who I really am attached to, I'm going to give him all my property. I'm going to make him my heir as if he was my son. So what included in all the property that you are giving to him is himself. So he's going to inherit all your property and himself, right? So he's being emancipated. It's like you're giving him a bill of manumission. He ends up freed. Now, what the Gemara is about to say is, but if you reserve any part of your property for yourself that you haven't given everything, right? I'm giving I hereby bequeath all my property to my Canaanite slave, except for some small part of my property. Later it's going to be defined as 1/10,000th of my property. So, didn't the Canaanite slave just receive everything except for 1/10,000th of your estate? And so if you're a rich guy, he just received so much property that he could easily free himself with it? Maybe so, but he's not free yet. And the reason is, it's very interesting, it's because the law of emancipating a Canaanite slave is based on the law of divorce from a marriage. If you say to your wife, here is your get, your bill of divorce, on condition that you never drink coffee again. So you just created a condition that maintains some kind of a bond between you and her. Because she's not fully emancipated. I mean, she's not fully divorced from you. It's on this condition that she never drink coffee again. So presumably if she ever did drink coffee, even by accident, then the divorce would not have taken hold. That divorce is not a divorce at all, because the whole concept of a divorce is that it is a complete and total separation, a break. Once you give a woman a get, she and you have no relationship whatsoever. And that's why she's free to go and marry another man. If you try to maintain some kind of a link, some kind of a bond, then it's not a divorce at all. And likewise, if there's any chance that you have not broken the bond between you and your Canaanite slave, then he's not free, right? And so if you say, I bequeath him all my property except for any little piece, the problem is that that little piece that you kept for yourself, if you didn't specify, I bequeath him all my property, except for this pen. I'm keeping this pen for myself. But everything else goes to the slave. That's okay. But if you don't specify and you say some tiny percentage of my estate I keep for myself and the rest I give to the slave, well, that tiny percentage might include ownership of the slave, and therefore you didn't break the bond cleanly and completely, and the slave is not free. Okay, that's the concept that informs what we're about to read. So with regard to one who writes, he gives via a document all of his property to his Canaanite slave. The slave has been emancipated. But if he reserved for himself any amount of land, then he has not been emancipated, as perhaps he reserved the slave for himself as well. Didn't he say, I'm just keeping some of my land? What does that have to do with the slave? Must be that if the slave is treated like land and you reserve some of your land, then you might have reserved some ownership of the slave, and that's why he's not emancipated. Rabbi Shimon says he always becomes a free man, regardless of the wording of the document, even if the owner reserved land for himself, unless it says in the document, all of my property is given to so-and-so my slave, except for 1/10,000th of it, right? It's a percentage, a tiny percentage, but a percentage of his estate, and his estate includes the slave, and so he didn't cleanly and completely break the bond between him and the slave. And Rav Dimi Bar Yosef says that Rabbi Elazar says the sages deemed movable property to be considered a significant reserving of property for oneself with regard to a slave, so that the slave is not emancipated when the owner gives him all of his other property. But they did not deem movable property that one withheld from his sons and earmarked for his wife to be considered a significant reserving of property with regard to her marriage contract. Now, this is based on that law that we've also covered a couple of times, that if you're going to now, you're lying on the deathbed and you're giving away property, now your wife has a right from her marriage contract to receive a specific payment when the husband dies. But if he gives her some other kind of property, like a piece of land, which is presumably worth a lot more than the amount of money specified in her marriage contract, and she accepts that gift of land, then she waives her right to the marriage contract payment, right? So that's kind of like the basics here. So here we go. But they did not deem movable property that one withheld from his sons and earmarked for his wife to be considered a significant reserving of property with regard to a marriage contract. Meaning, if you kept some movable property and said, I'm setting this aside for my wife, she can accept that, and she doesn't give up her right to the marriage contract the way she would if she accepted land. And Rava said to Rav Nachman, what is the reason for this? Rav Nachman explained, a Canaanite slave is considered movable property, and reserving a movable property is considered a significant reserving with regard to movable property. But a woman's marriage contract is a document concerning land, right? A ketubah is secured. It has a lien of interest on land owned by the husband, not movable property. Since the payment of, which is superior, land is much superior to movable property as a security interest. But a woman's marriage contract is a document concerning land, since the payment of the marriage contract is collected from land. And reserving movable property is not considered a significant reserving with regard to land. So Rav Nachman states that a Canaanite slave is therefore considered movable property. Now we're on page 150b. Rav Ashi said to Ravina, the reason the slave is not emancipated if the master reserved part of his property for himself is not that the slave is included in the property that the owner reserved for himself. Rather, we teach this law as being due to the fact that the document is not a bill of manumission. Right? The equivalent of a get for a wife is a bill of manumission for a slave. The document by which, if you hand that to the slave, he becomes free. We teach this law as being due to the fact that the document is not a bill of manumission that completely severs the bond between the slave and the master. You're giving him all this property, right? A written document that grants him all this property. If you reserve something for yourself, well, maybe that part of yourself that you kept for yourself includes some ownership of the slave, and that's why such a document is not equivalent to a bill of manumission. Now, Rava says that Rav Nachman says there are 5 types of gifts to which specific halachas, specific laws, apply. But the halachas do not apply until the owners write a deed granting all of their property to another person without reserving anything for themselves. And they are as follows, right? So again, we're back to our Mishna, that we are Mishna number 7 here in chapter 9, which basically said, you're on your deathbed, you write a deed making a gift to someone. If you give him all your property while you're on your deathbed, so this shows that the person obviously expects to die and not recover from the illness, and that's why he's giving everything he owns to a certain person. He's not leaving himself anything to live off, to make a livelihood from, in case he recovers from this deathbed illness. And so if he does recover, we invalidate the gift. It's as if he gave that person nothing. But if he reserves something for himself, and the Mishnah said any amount, but we mean any amount with which he can actually live off, then whatever else he gave away while on his deathbed remains given away, even if he recovers. Okay? So now we're saying that there are special laws when somebody gives away everything on the deathbed. So these laws do not apply until, unless the owners write a deed granting all their property to another person without reserving anything for themselves. And these are the 5 laws. The gift of a person on his deathbed, like we've been talking about, a gift to one's Canaanite slave, a gift to one's wife, a gift to one's sons, and the gift of a woman who shelters her property from her prospective husband, right? So these 5 areas of special laws, one of them is when you give away all your property to someone while on your deathbed. The other 4 are not on a deathbed. But what happens if you give away all your property to someone when you're not on your deathbed? Did you just give everything away? If you're not on your deathbed, then there's no reason to assume that you were thinking to give it all away because you're dying. Well, you're not dying. So is this gift going to be valid? Well, let's look at the conditions, the circumstances of these other 4. On the deathbed, we've covered. Right? The Gemara explains each of these cases. In the case of a gift of a person on his deathbed, this is as we learned in the Mishnah we're now talking about that originally appeared on page 146b, that with regard to a person on his deathbed who wrote a deed granting all of his property to others and he reserved for himself any amount of land, his gift stands even if he subsequently recovers. But if he did not reserve for himself any amount of land and he recovered, his gift does not stand, as the gift was conditional upon his death, since evidently he did not intend to leave himself without means of support if he survived. Therefore, we invalidate the gift if he recovers. Second case, In the case of a gift to one's slave, this is as we learned in a Mishna, Peh 3:8. With regard to one who writes a deed granting all of his property to his Canaanite slave, the slave has been emancipated. But if he reserved for himself any amount of land, then the slave has not been emancipated, as perhaps he reserved the slave for himself as well, which would indicate that the slave is treated like ownership of land. In the case of a gift to one's wife, this is, as Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, one who writes a deed granting all of his property to his wife renders her only a steward of his property, i.e., he intends only to place her in charge of the property, and she does not acquire it. Since he has sons, he has heirs, he's not trying to disinherit them. He's saying that his wife is going to be in charge of administering the estate on behalf of his sons. Presumably they are her sons as well. And it's only because he gave all of it to her. But if he gave 99% of it to her and saved 1% for his sons, then she would get the 99% and she could keep it. But because he gave 100, she is understood to be a steward on behalf of the heirs. According to Rav Nachman, this applies only if he did not reserve any part of the property for himself. In the case of a gift to one's sons, this is as we learned in the Mishnah, Tractate Peah 3:7. With regard to one who writes a deed granting all of his property to his sons, and he writes in the deed that he grants any amount of land to his wife, then she forfeits payment of her marriage contract if she doesn't object at the time of receiving this gift of land. If he reserves any amount of land for himself, then his wife does not forfeit payment of her marriage contract. Instead, she gets this gift of land in addition to the money specified in her ketubah. And the fifth case is something we haven't encountered before. Those first four we've talked about before. Now something new. In the case of a gift of a woman who shelters her property from her intended husband. She doesn't want to bring this property into the marriage. Now remember, a woman brings property into a marriage. Her husband has the use of that property. If, for example, she brings a field into the marriage, then while they're married, the husband can farm the field and keep the produce. And he has a right to the produce of the field because he is also sustaining his wife. He has an obligation to provide for all her needs. And in return for that, any property that she brings into the marriage, he has the use of it, right? The use of it, not the ownership. Because if he dies or he divorces her, she gets that property back. Right? And then when she leaves the marriage, it's still her property, something she inherited from her father, for example. Her husband can use it while they're married, but she owns it, and when the marriage ends, she can take it with her. But what if she doesn't want her husband to have the use of it even while they're married? Then what she can do is shelter it, right? So it's this shelter. I called it a prenup in the title. But what is she doing? What is the device by which she will shelter this property from the marriage? Where am I? So in the case of a gift of a woman who shelters her property from her intended husband, this is as the master says. In the case of a woman who wishes to shelter her property from her prospective husband, she must write a deed granting all of her property to some other person. If she reserves for herself any amount of property, then she cannot reclaim the property if she is widowed or divorced. Right? So if she writes all of it to someone, then when she's widowed or divorced, it's clear that she only made that gift to shelter it from the marriage, and now that her marriage has ended, she can get that gift back. But if she keeps something for herself at the time of making this gift to another person, then we do not say she did this with the intent of sheltering it from the marriage. We would say, well, she gave away a bunch of property and that gift was a valid gift, so the recipient acquired it. And later, when her marriage ends, she doesn't get it back. How do we know that her intention was not to give it away How do we know that her intention was to give it away? Is because she gave away a large part, but she kept some for herself. And that signals that she meant to make a valid gift, not to shelter it from the marriage. Now, of course, I think we keep saying this, all of this could have been, in terms of what is her intention. If she spelled out her intention and made a contract spelling out clearly what her intention is, then we would respect her intention. It's when these gifts were made without spelling it out that we attribute intention. And that's why we would say, well, she gave it all away. Obviously, the intention was to shelter it. But if she just gave a lot away, then her intention seems to be to make a gift, because she already kept something for herself to sustain herself, and she took that into the marriage with her, and she presumably will take it out later. Now, the Gemara concludes. Now, those 5 cases, right, where we see if someone gives all of it away, it's like they didn't really mean to give it away. They had a device in mind that was suited for another purpose. But if they kept something for themselves, then it's like, okay, well, they made a big gift, and the gift was a gift. Okay, now in all those 5 cases, with regard to all these cases, reserving movable property is considered a significant reserving of property, right? We said if they keep something for themselves, then whatever they gave away is given away. Do we say that what they reserve for themselves needs to be real property, or could it also be movable property? So according to this, movable property will do. Presumably it still has to be a significant amount that they can live off, but then if it is a significant amount, even if it's movable property, it's considered they reserve something for themselves, and whatever they gave away is given away. So with regard to all these cases, reserving movable property is considered a significant reserving of property, except with regard to a woman's marriage contract. If one grants all of his property to his sons, except for any amount of land which he gives to his wife, and he reserves for himself only movable property, his wife forfeits payment of her marriage contract, as nothing remains in the husband's possession from which she is entitled to collect payment, because movable property for this scenario is not considered significant enough. It means he gave away everything. She accepted to receive this land. There's going to be nothing for her to collect the ketubah from, so she's not going to get a ketubah payment, but instead she got this piece of land, and that's why she didn't object. And this is because the sages instituted that the lien on the marriage contract is placed on land. And the sages did not institute that the marriage contract can be collected from movable property. And this is to protect the wife. Right? We want her to be able to collect from land, because land is land. It never goes away. Movable property can get used up and disappear, but land will always be there. Maimar said, with regard to movable property that is explicitly written in the marriage contract as property from which the debt may be collected, and it is still extant, right? It is still in existence. If the husband reserves this property for himself, this is considered a significant reserving of property, and his wife does not forfeit payment of her marriage contract. So he gave all the land to his sons, except he gave some land to his wife, and he kept movable property for himself, enough movable property that the wife's ketubah could be paid from it. Then, when she didn't object to receiving that amount of land, okay, she got the land, and she has kept the right to collect her ketubah from what? From that significant movable property that the husband kept for himself when he gave everything else away to his sons. If one said, my property shall go to so-and-so, anything that is referred to as property is included in the gift. So a Canaanite slave is called property, as we learned in the Mishna, Tractate Path 3.8. With regard to one who writes, i.e. gives via document all his property to his Canaanite slave, the slave has been emancipated. So we know that a slave is called property. Land is called property, as we learned in the Mishna, Tractate Kedushin. Property that serves as a guarantee, i.e. land, can be acquired by means of money, by means of a deed, or by taking possession of it. So land is called property. Property that serves as a cloak, as well as other garments and movable property, they are also called property. As we learned in that same Mishnah, and property that does not serve as a guarantee, meaning it is not land, therefore it is movable property, can only be acquired by pulling, right? The formal act of acquisition when it is transferred from one person to another is he has to move it or cause it to be moved, etc. But the word property will apply to movable property in the way that it does to real property. Now, money, special case of movable property. Is it called property? Yes, money is called property, as we learned in that same Mishnah. And property that does not serve as a guarantee can be acquired together with property that serves as a guarantee by means of money, by means of a deed, or by taking possession of it. These are the ways to make a kinyan. Money is among the types of property that can be acquired by means of the acquisition of land, as is evident from this incident involving Rav Papa. We've heard this story a couple times, who had 12,000 dinars that he loaned to the people of Bei Chozai. And Rav Papa was afraid he was never going to get that loan back. But Rav Shmuel Bar Acha was kind of younger and willing to take on the collection duty. So could he go there and say, give me the money, I'm here as the agent of Rav Papa? That would have been problematic, as we learned in that story. We don't have to go into those details here. But what Rav Papa wanted is that Rav Shmuel Bar Acha should have greater authority to collect the loan than simply, I'm here to collect for my principal. What he wanted was that Rav Shmuel Bar Acha should say, I'm here to collect the loan that is owed to me. The creditor has shown up. So what Rav Papa wants to do is to transfer the right to collect that loan, right, to Rav Shmuel Bar Acha, meaning that now he owns it. So how do you collect? So what what he's doing, he really trusts him, right, is saying, okay, the 12,000 dinars that are owed to me, now they're owed to you. Well, how are you going to do that? Maybe there's no promissory note. Maybe clearly the money's not here. So how are you going to transfer the right to collect those 12,000 dinars? Not just that Shmuel is going to act as an agent, but that they're now owed to him, right? And so remember what he did is he sold him a very small piece of land, like the threshold of his house. But along with this small piece of land came the right to collect those 12,000 dinars. So one way to transfer money is to transfer it along with a transfer of land. Rav Papa transferred ownership of the money to Rav Shmuel Bar Acha, who was traveling to Bei Chozai, by means of transferring ownership of the threshold of his house, so that Rav Shmuel Bar Acha could collect the money. And when Rav Shmuel Bar Acha came back with the money, Rav Papa was so pleased that he went out as far as Tavach to meet him. But from that story, we know that money is called property. Next item, that is it called property or not? A deed. Right? So we know that land is called property. Do we say that the deed to the land, that this is also called property? As Rabba Bar Yitzchak says, there are two types of deeds with regard to the acquisition of land. If one said to the witnesses, acquire this field on behalf of so-and-so and write the deed for him as proof of the sale, the giver can retract the deed, but he cannot retract the transfer of ownership of the land once the other party has taken possession of it, right? Once the deed is written, the deal is not yet done. So even though he had the deed written, if he changes his mind, he can take the deed back. He can retract the deal. But once the person who's going to receive the land has actually taken possession of the land, then the deal has been finalized and he can no longer retract. That's when the deed was worded like this. Acquire the field on behalf of so-and-so and write the deed for him as proof of the sale. The deed was proof of the sale. It's like a receipt. It wasn't the actual device for transferring ownership of the land. if one said, acquire this field on behalf of so-and-so, on the condition that you write the deed for him, then the giver can retract both the deed and the transfer of the field, as he stipulated that the acquisition of the field is dependent on the writing of the deed. Presumably, once the deed, he can get out of this until the deed has been handed over, because then it's done, and now it's too late. And Rav Chia bar Avin says that Rav Huna says there are three types of deeds. Two are those that we stated above, and there's another. If the seller wrote the deed in advance and kept it until the buyer would come and pay him. And the Gemara adds parenthetically, this is like that law that we learned in a Mishna on page 167b, which went like this. And now we're at the top of page 151a. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. A scribe may write a deed of sale for the seller of property at the seller's request, even if the buyer is not with him when he presents his request, as the deed obligates only the seller. In this case, once the buyer, has taken possession of the land, the deed is acquired wherever it is. And this is, as it is stated in the Mishna that we learned in Tractate Kedushin 26a, property that does not serve as a guarantee, that would be movable property as opposed to land, can be acquired together with the property that serves as a guarantee. I'm selling you this field together with the wagons and together with the wagons and farming equipment that are on it. That would be allowing you, when you take possession of the land, you're also taking possession of the movable property, because I've attached the movable property to the land. So when you buy the land and take possession of the land, you get the movable property too. If I didn't attach it to the land, if I was just selling you a wagon and some farming equipment, you would have to go where that wagon and farming equipment are, cause them to move so that you would have made a kinyan, and now they're yours. And until then, they're not yours, even though you handed over money, right? So property that does not serve as a guarantee can be acquired together with the property that does serve as a guarantee by means of money, by means of a deed, or by taking possession of it, because you attach the movable property to the land. So these are the methods of taking possession of land. One can learn from this that a deed is included in the term property that does not serve as a guarantee. An animal is called property, as we learned in the Mishnah, Tractate Shekalim 12a. In the case of one who consecrated his property, and on the property there were animals fit to be sacrificed upon the altar, male animals are sacrificed as burnt offerings, and female animals are sold for the purpose of being sacrificed as peace offerings. Birds are called property, as we learned in the Mishnah, Tractate Shekalim 12a, in a case of one who consecrated his property, and on the property there were items that were fit to be sacrificed upon the altar, for example, wine or oil or birds. Rabbi Eliezer says they are sold for the needs of that kind of item, i.e. to individuals who will use them as such. Tefillin is called property, as we learned in a Mishnah, Tractate Arachin 23b, with regard to one who consecrates his property, the value of his tefillin is assessed for him, and he redeems them by paying their value to the temple treasury. You consecrated all your property. Did that include your tefillin? Answer, yes. So you're not going to give your tefillin to the temple. Now you have to assess what the value is, and you give that much money to the temple treasury. This is all when you make a consecration when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. A dilemma was raised before the sages with regard to a Torah scroll. What is the law? Can it be called property or not? Does one say that since it is not sold, as it is prohibited to sell a Torah scroll, it is therefore not considered property? Or perhaps one says that since it may be sold in order to enable one to study Torah or to marry a woman, it is considered property. And the Gemara concludes the dilemma shall stand unresolved. Teiku. That's what I've got for us today. Let's look at a few comments and questions. Sharon, I am intrigued by the selling of a city. Didn't individuals own homes within the city? I would say that this is not your standard city, where people own homes, etc. But rather, this is more like Levittown, right? It's like a developer built the whole city. Somehow he owns the city. Or, remember we saw the case of Alexander, right? Alexander conquered cities, okay? So by force of might, he made them his own. And then he would gift cities to other people. Now you would say, well, don't people live there? Don't they own houses within that city? In the ancient world, and maybe even the modern world too, you see conquest and wars of conquest, and then it's not so simple. But I think here we're really talking about a guy, they use the word city, but they're really talking about somebody who owned a big piece of land, and then he started developing it so that he would have some kind of mercantile interest there, and he needed employees, and he built houses for them, but he really owns all of it. And then he wants to sell it to another rich guy so he can do that. Bill, I suspect there's some element of reform in the fact that halakhic law does assume under normal circumstances that a slave is more like land than, say, a cow. Consider, who as a matter of law is the ultimate owner of all the land of Eretz Yisrael? God, of course. Which is why land under Torah law is regularly being restored once every few years to its original owners. And this was, I suspect, meant to be a less than subtle hint from Hashem to recalcitrant mortals that just as the earth is the Lord's, so too every person is the Lord's, which is to say, not ours to buy and sell. And hey, it only took us, a few thousand years to work it out. Exactly. I mean, it's exactly right, Bill. You got it exactly right. The Torah introduced this idea into the culture. And I'll tell you that people, who lived 2,000 years ago, and certainly 3,000 years ago, if you tell them, we're going to arrive at a time when slavery is looked upon with disgust, then it will have become illegal everywhere in the world and might exist a little bit here and there in pockets practiced by evil people, but the world will have moved past slavery, those people would have thought, you're insane. It was an incredible reform that was brought into the world by the Torah. So very nice explanation. Bill, another comment. So just to make sure I've understood correctly, if the master on his deathbed specifies what he's reserving and it doesn't include the slave, it still breaks the bond as required. So for example, I give all my property to my slave except for this one field, which I would like to be made into a cemetery and be buried in. He reserves some land, but he specified which land and what use he has for it, so the slave is free now. Okay, that's my understanding. That the difference was, did he reserve some land, right? Enough land for him to make a living off, or did he reserve that field? And if it was that field, but gave everything else to the slave, then I would say, the slave is freed because he was included in everything else, right? That field is not somehow synonymous with any part of the slave. It's just that if he said, I keep some real property for myself, then the slave might be included in that, and we don't have the clean break. And finally, Shandora, would a woman keeping her cooking utensils be considered keeping movable property that nullifies her gift given to keep her property? It seems like, maybe I spoke wrong, it's whether the husband reserved something for himself or not, and the woman accepts the gift or didn't accept the gift, right? So, maybe what you're saying is, if he kept for himself the property that you would associate with her, right? I'm giving away all my land to my sons, but I'm keeping for myself all of my wife's cooking utensils. Did he just retain enough movable property for himself to say, I've got something that I can, live off of if necessary? And if my wife accepts this, she's going to be in the house, she's going to keep using it. Therefore, she accepts that there's nothing for her to, draw her ketubah from, or she does. I think you kind of zeroed in right on the crux of the question, but I think that what they're really saying is, did he retain something for himself when he gave away all his property? And this doesn't seem to be a deathbed issue, right? If he says, I'm giving away everything, and maybe, he's not sick, so he's going to be able to, acquire more property later. So really what's being asked is, did he retain something that she, can collect from in the event that he dies or divorces her, that the ketubah can be collected from? Did he retain something that's enough to pay off her ketubah? Then, if she doesn't object when she receives some land, now, right, then what she's saying is, well, I keep the land that he just gave me, and I don't object to this because he did reserve for himself something that the ketubah can be collected from. So I get the land, and I expect my ketubah to be paid off. But if he only reserved for himself just a small amount of movable property and not enough to pay off her ketubah, then when she accepts that land gift, she's saying, okay, I'd rather have this land than a right to collect my ketubah sometime later. He didn't reserve enough for himself. I'm not objecting. So I give up the ketubah payment because there's nothing for me to collect it from. And it's worth it for me to do that because I just got some land right now that I can put to work, that I can, call my own, that I can build a house on, that I can bring in, tenant farmers to make produce from. That's how I'm reading it. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday, at the regular Monday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.